Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Vedic Astrology podcast. My name is Fiona Marks, and today I am here with a guest, Craig Hoyle, and we are going to be examining a fascinating case study. But before we dive into any details, I wanted to invite Craig to say hello to everyone. Would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners, Craig?
Hello, my name is Craig Hoyle, and I am a year 4 apprentice with the Asheville Vedic Astrology apprenticeship program. This chart we're doing is part of my required work for the practicum, where I do a full chart assessment of 10,000 words on a particular individual.
I know, and I'm really excited to talk about this chart. I have such a great job as the custodian of the Asheville Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship Program on teachable.com because I get to read all of this amazing work, and today is no different. We have, as Craig was saying, one of the 10,000 word papers. It's on Elvis Presley, who has an incredible life, one of those really remarkable lives, touched so many people. But before we dive into Elvis himself, Craig, tell us a little bit about your journey towards becoming an astrologer. What is it that got you started with astrology, and how did you decide to study at the level that you're at now?
In 2016, I was finishing up getting my bachelor's degree in psychology, and I found myself in this place where I didn't really know what the next step should be. I had become familiar with Ryan Kurzag through his Kriya Yoga work. I was thinking about something one day, and then he popped into my head. I'm like, oh, that's right. He does astrology too. So I went to his website and I booked a reading just for a consultation on what the next step should be in terms of my life once I graduated from college. And it was really good reading, and I enjoyed it, and it got me more interested in astrology. And I started watching like videos based that Ryan put out based on my chart reading, and one thing led to another. And in 2017, I enrolled in the apprenticeship program and started the Rashis and Signs course. And I've had my head in astrology books and software ever since.
It's a great story. And what a wonderful combination. I didn't know about your background in psychology. So very powerful combination, astrology and psychology.
Thank you. As I'm going through the year 4 practicum, where I'm starting to do more assessment as part of preparing for the active work as an astrologer, a lot of what I've learned in my psychology studies is starting to come more and more into alignment with what I'm learning about astrology and what I'm going to put in practice.
We were lucky enough on the podcast to have an interview with Suzanne, who is a practicing psychologist and also an astrologer, and just looking at all of those crossovers and how they really benefit each other. So I hope you guys can catch up on that episode. Now, what led you to choose Elvis Presley for a subject of one of your 10,000 word papers?
My wife and I, with her parents, went to go see the 2022 movie that came out about him. And it was a really good movie, and it really opened the door into exploring his life, because he is this larger than life person, almost in the fabric of our culture and society at this point, because that level of fame resonated with a generation. And so I thought it was a really interesting person to dive in and study some of the different aspects of his life from an astrological perspective.
I think that is an occupational hazard of being an astrologer, is that whenever you watch or read biography, you want to look at the chart. And we're very lucky that you did in this case. So for anybody on planet Earth who hasn't heard of Elvis Presley, let's, in a very humble way, try to outline some of the main things that we should be aware of. So I'm aware that he was a musician, but that perhaps doesn't do justice to his life. Can you give us some of the main peaks and troughs of the life of Elvis Presley?
He got his start in the mid-50s when rock and roll in America was just starting to take off and become more of a pop culture thing. So he quickly rose to being like one of the predominant performers of that type of music. And he took the term overnight sensation because he had a unique performance style, which I think it was mostly from his stage fright, where he would shake and shimmy a lot. And of course, in very conservative 1950s America, that was seen as almost scandalous. So it catapulted into even more fame because of the sensationalism of it, because it was seen as something new something different. He was a very charismatic performer, and he was a bit of a risk taker. He liked to buck the system a little bit. And so he came in and quickly rose to fame. And there was a lot of attention. If you look back at some of the early performers, the response from the audience was just, I don't think we can really compare it to anything today. There's the emotional outpouring that an artist like him generated. He went into service. He was drafted and served for a couple of years. And then when he came back, he started doing movies in Hollywood, which was something that his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, who many people see as this nefarious person in his life, because he did help Elvis achieve a lot of fame. He also took a sizable portion for himself. And that was an interesting dynamic in their relationship. But Elvis went through the 60s and did a bunch of movies and became an actor. And then in the late 60s, he reignited his career very successfully as a performer. And up until his death in 1974 was predominantly a touring musician and a performance artist who did like television specials and movies around some of his concerts. And that resurgence did reintroduce him to the popular culture. And he had another surge in his career, which he rode up until his death in 77.
And he was kind of larger than life for us on the outside, wasn't he? Very famous person, but also extravagant, like a lot of possessions, a lot of excess.
Yes. Yes. And that's something that is another interesting aspect of. He was a very generous person and was known to give all kinds of gifts to people. He loved to give cars to people. He also loved to give horses to people, which some of the horses he kept at Graceland, his house, which is now a landmark. That was part of the larger than life persona that surrounded him. It's just this wealth that just poured out of him and this opulence that just really was just everywhere he was. He had always wore flashy jewelry, but he was also very generous, and he did with a lot of charities that he worked with, and everything was on this larger than life scale. It was just like the biggest and the best. And so that's part of the mystique around him. Where do you find the person in all of that mystique? Because you look at pictures of him and images of him in some of his more flashy outfits and stuff. And it's very interesting to see that larger than life persona, like on stage and interacting with others, and just very compelling kind of person to be around, I would imagine.
And he was also married and had a daughter. And did he come from a religious background, or he had a real connection to Christianity?
His family was very poor. Because of the poverty of his family, his father actually got into some trouble and did some time in jail. So for a little while, it was just him and his mother getting by. And they were forced to move into the lower economic areas of where they were, which was very rural. He was around a lot of African-American communities and families. And that's where his appreciation of blues and gospel music came from. And so he emerged out of that kind of Bible Belt, I would say, gospel Christian form here in America. And that stayed with him throughout his life. In addition to his pop music, he actually put out regularly gospel albums that sold very well. And so he had a very devout faith that he presented it like he's just a humble person, which is interesting when you see him on stage. He's very animated and actively outward, but he also had this very humble and devout quality that probably was an influence from his mother, who was a very strong person in his life. Things like philosophy and belief and religion are something that's very important to him. All his life, he was almost on a quest to gain a little bit more understanding of, but it was always juxtaposed with the demands of fame, which I thought was another interesting aspect of his life, is that I found that there was a real struggle between the demands of everyday life versus the desires and the wants that normally that people, when they become that level of success, they have the opportunity to engage in it and really work with. And he just never seemed to give himself that time.
The life of really famous people is intriguing, that real push and pull between what the person wants themselves and this enormous, it's almost calling, like the call to fame and the cost that comes with that. I think that is a lovely segue for us to jump into his chart. So for those listening along today, let's clear our minds. Perhaps you're going to visualize a chart in your mind as we let you know that we're looking at the birth chart of Elvis Presley, born at 4:35 in
Tupelo, Mississippi.
on the 8th of January, 1935. That is giving us a Sagittarius ascendant at 12 degrees and 21 minutes. So a Sagittarius ascendant for the first house. And then in the second house of Capricorn, we have 3 planets. We have the Sun, Mercury, and Venus, all in Capricorn. In the third house of Aquarius, we have Rahu with Saturn. And then in the fourth house of Pisces, we have the Moon. And then we have a whole lot of open sky because there's no planets in the fifth house of Aries, no planets in the sixth house of Taurus, no planets in the seventh house of Gemini, no planets in the eighth house of Cancer. Then in Leo, we have Ketu. The ninth house Leo has Ketu. And then in the 10th house of Virgo, no planets. 11th house Libra has Mars. And finally, the 12th house of Scorpio has Jupiter. So we are going to be starting this chart by looking at the first house, but we cannot help but notice that Jupiter, the ascendant lord, that abundant planet of opportunities, is in the 12th house of expenses and contemplation. So we've got plenty to look forward to today in our discussion of the birth chart of Elvis Presley. And Craig, let's dive right in and have a look at the first house being Sagittarius. What were some of the key things that stood out for you? And for those watching on screen, I have Craig's paper here, so you might like to follow along. And I will let you know how you can get in touch with Craig if you would like to get a copy of the paper or follow up with some questions. But Craig, what are some things that stood out to you about the first house?
In my assessment, one of the things that I focused on was the fact that Moon is the only planet that is Rashi aspecting the first house. The Moon is in the fourth house. And the fourth house is mother. And also the Moon is mother. And it was like that fixated on me because Presley did have an incredibly close relationship to his mother. I read when I was researching his paper, one of the things that I found that they would sometimes actually talk to each other. And this is when Presley was an adult. They would still talk, baby talk to each other because it was kind of like this endearing quality that they had of, they were just incredibly close. And having that Moon just hitting his first house of personality and the body and a sense of self touches versus that idea that his mother was such a presence in his life.
Yeah, Rashi aspects are so important, aren't they? They're the first thing I think we cover in the apprenticeship, and they help us see how things are going to materialize, so they can be really useful insights. And the Moon is definitely, as you mentioned, the mother, and it's in the fourth house here. But it's also music, isn't it? The Moon and music, and the Moon and the general public. So this Rashi aspect seems to be quite important to the first house.
And then also because the Moon is the ruler of the eighth, then a lot of those eighth house themes are going to come into play as well, which hidden emotions and emotional defenses. And because the Moon is in an enemy's dignity there. And so there's going to be some trouble with that. There's going to be some feelings of insecurity with that. His Moon is also his Dara Karaka, or the Karaka of the spouse. So then there's another layer to this, and that one spouse is also going to be an impactful person in his life and his bodily experience. And one thing that I did find in my research, Presley lost his mother in 1958 after a short illness. And it was a loss that he never fully recovered from. And then his wife, Priscilla, they divorced, I believe, in 1972. And that was also an event in his life that he never really recovered from either. With the eighth house of breaks and changes involved in this, these kind of influential individuals in his life that they're leaving created a feeling of lack around it, a loss. So it was something that it was a bit of a hurdle for him to deal with.
Do we want to say about Jupiter as the ascendant lord in relation to the first house?
Having your first lord going into the 12th house is really placing the focus of your life on 12th house agendas, like you said, expenses and liberation. He spent very lavishly. That was a theme in his life. And also spirituality was a very prominent aspect of his life.
Yeah, it's hard to know the self, isn't it? It's a great blessing of having the First Lord in the 12th house, is that connection with transcendence, that connection with moksha. But of course, that can be escaping into addiction. It depends which way that transcendence is going to go. And having the First Lord in the 12th house can make one very spiritual, very ethereal, in some ways not here or of another place. And you wonder whether Elvis was able to truly know who he was. It's a very interesting thing to say, isn't it, about someone who's very famous, because of course they have a huge ego, or they appear to have a huge ego. They have a huge personality and we think we all know them. But do we know the true person? And does the person truly know themselves in this physical realm? Really interesting having the Ascendant Lord in the 12th house.
And also Jupiter is his Matrikarka, which is the planet of his mother. So this is also, once again, bringing into this the theme of the mother as being a strong presence in his life. And of course, Jupiter being a natural karaka of children, having that in the 12th house, that's going to also play a part in those relationships.
Absolutely. So let's have a look then at the second house, which is Capricorn. And we've got 3 planets here. So there's a lot to talk about.
We have Jupiter is Rashi aspect in the second house. And so that's going to really help with manifesting wealth and fortune and grace and creativity to one's personal income. There's also going to be a sense of responsibility with that, though, because Jupiter is the Lord of the first, and the second is also the house of family, and Jupiter rules the 4th of home. Presley actually, Graceland, he bought it for his parents. We're starting to see a lot of his actions weren't necessarily were partly for himself, but also other people around him, family and relatives and individuals that he surrounded himself with that he probably viewed as family. We also have Sun Mercury, and Mercury is combust. So that's going to give some difficulty with developing like healthy boundaries and with expression, self-expression, and especially around people who he felt were authority figures in his life. Colonel Tom Parker was his manager. Most managers took about 20% off of what their stars earned, and Colonel Tom Parker took 50%. And then there was also a lot of side negotiations, side deals, like merchandising deals and stuff that he also took advantage of. And one of the things that I kept finding again and again was the idea that Presley didn't really have the capacity to confront in those type of situations. There is conjecture about how much he knew as far as what Colonel Tom Parker was doing. And it's like the attitude was, as long as I have what I like, as long as I have my things, then I don't care, because it's like I still have my stuff. And so it's kind of up for debate about whether or not he was really okay with a lot of this in terms of what other people recollect and how much he knew. What I found in this chart is like that even if it's something he was aware of, that would be something he would probably have trouble confronting Parker. He had trouble finding his voice in that. Second house is of speech too.
Totally. It plays into that First Lord in the 12th house, which makes, again, boundary setting kind of difficult. And then with what you were just saying, made me go have a look at the Shadbala. And I was thinking about Ayana Bala, because that's how we confront things. And that Jupiter, the Ascendant Lord Ayana Bala, is quite low, just 8 points out of 60. And like you say, Jupiter is probably very generous in these kind of situations. As long as my bank account is okay and I can buy what I want for the people that I love, then why should I risk any kind of confrontation? It's all that confluence around Mercury being combust, Jupiter being in the 12th house, then maybe having some challenges with Ayana Bala. We're beginning to see some patterns there. And Mercury is the 7th Lord. It owns Gemini, the 7th house. So some sneaky deals, perhaps some sneaky negotiations from our partners, perhaps is what is going on there. All right. And anything else to share about the second house?
Yeah, we do have the sun there, and the sun is going to cause some separation. And of course, it's with Venus, wife, and luxury. So there's going to be some separation, trouble in fulfilling a lot of the relationships, particularly with his wife, because there's this striving for achievement of trying to fulfill one's inspirations and ambitions for their second house, because we have the sun there. And the sun is his ruler of his ninth, of these purpose and ideals. So that's going to get in the way of family in a way too, because there's going to be that aspect of, I'm doing this for you, but not necessarily so that we can be together. It's more like, I'm doing this to provide for you more so than really providing it for us.
Yeah. Doing it for you rather than doing it with you. It's hard to be a partner at that level with him. As a total tangent, as I'm looking at it as well, it makes me think about his military service, having the sun in the second house, having the 10th Lord in the second house.
Yes, and he was drafted and he did serve, and he entered as an enlisted man. And when he completed, he had been promoted to sergeant, I believe. So he did very well in the military, and he did not take any payment. He donated the payment.
And how did he reflect on that in later years? Did he look back fondly on his time in the military, or we don't know anything about that?
There was a couple things that came into his awareness, and one was karate. He learned karate, and that was something that he actually did for the remainder of his life. He practiced karate. And if you look at some of his stage performances later in his life, he's actually integrates a lot of karate moves into his performance. But then the other aspect is, this is where he discovered amphetamines, which at that time was not seen as something harmful, in the sense that they were seen as like a benefit. There, people in the military with him said that he had almost evangelical zeal about it, where he would just espouse the benefits of it.
And amphetamines, they're stimulants, are they?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
I didn't know if you wanted to explore perhaps his hora.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the hora for those people listening. The hora is also a Sagittarius ascendant. No planets in Sagittarius, no planets in Capricorn. Rahu's remaining in Aquarius. The moon is also remaining in Pisces. There's no planets in Aries, but Jupiter has moved from Scorpio and it is now in Taurus. So Jupiter in Taurus, the sixth house of the hora. Nothing in Gemini. And then our whole cohort from Capricorn, Sun, Mercury, Venus, they've all moved from Capricorn. They're now in Cancer, the eighth house. And K2 has joined Saturn in Leo, and then nothing in Virgo, and Mars remains in Libra, nothing in the 12th house of Scorpio. And why would we look at the hora now? What's your instinct there?
The hora is prosperity and also responsibility. So it reveals like our capacity for those things. And the moon is an important planet for that. His moon is an enemy's dignity. So that tells us that there's some trouble in feeling satisfied with their wealth, and maybe feeling like they're not wealthy enough, which could probably propel someone to further drive them into working harder. And then we have Sun, Mercury, and Venus. They're all with the second cusp. And we have Sun and great friends, and Mercury and Venus are neutral here. And Jupiter's aspecting, but it is in neutral dignity. And we have an aspect from Rahu playing into this from Aquarius. And so there's going to be some confusion and inconsistency in dealing with his wealth and managing that and feeling successful and prosperous overall, because that Rahu is going to bring that confusion to those planets. So while we can see like in the Rashi that there's some strong positives, if you think of the hora in terms of like how the person feels inwardly, we see that there is some confusion, which can result in what you might say is like lavish spending to try to make myself seem more prosperous or make myself feel like things are successful and working out well.
Jupiter moving from being in the 12th house, where it's very generous and charitable in the D1, and in the hora, it's there in the 6th house of enemies and hard work. And we can see that the need to give in some ways becomes an enemy or becomes an obstacle.
One of the things that came up in our feedback is a discussion of what made him remarkably successful. And one of the yogas that I found is called a Vishnu Yoga. And that is the Navamsha Lord of the 9th Lord joins the 10th Lord in the 2nd with the 9th Lord.
All right, so let's break that down. For those who are on screen, I'm going to put on the Navamsha. Navamsha is a Cancer ascendant, Moon and Mercury in Cancer, nothing in Leo, Venus in Virgo, Rahu in Libra. Nothing in Scorpio, Jupiter in Sagittarius, Mars exalted in Capricorn. Nothing in Aquarius, nothing in Pisces, K2 in Aries, Saturn in Taurus, and the Sun in Gemini. That's the Navamsha. And we were just orientating ourselves to that because there is a core yoga here called a Vishnu Yoga, the Navamsha Lord of the Ninth Lord. So let's slow that down, everybody. Okay, so what is the ninth Lord in the D1? It is the Sun, correct?
Yep.
Yep. And therefore, what is the Navamsha Lord of the Sun? So we need to go look at the D9, and it is in Gemini. So we know that Mercury is going to be the Navamsha Lord of the ninth Lord from the D1. So we're looking at to see if Mercury joins the 10th Lord in the second with the ninth Lord. And yes, tick, tick, tick. There are quite a few requirements there, but we managed to meet them all. And what does this yoga tend to indicate?
The quote, I believe, from Parsha that Ernst has in the software, it says, one leads a happy and enjoyable life, accumulating fortune in various lands, knowledgeable and a good conversationalist. One is favored by rulers and enjoys perfect health to 100 years of age. It says that the combination of the ninth and 10th lords in the second indicates purposeful activities are a source of security and reward, which we already saw indications for, just generally looking for the idea of a focus of really trying to accumulate resources. But we also have planets that are dealing with the ninth and the 10th and involved in the second. So these are all wealth houses and activities houses and career houses and purpose housing. So we have quite a lot of energy going towards this. We can see the potential how that can start to lead to that level of success.
I find these core yogas add so much value to a reading. They give you insights into things. So they're well worth having a look, see what might be there in the chart, being like the gems or the jewels in the crown. The chart gives us all the architectural structure that's there, but are there any really brilliant, sparkling gems? And perhaps this is one in the case of Elvis's chart. And if we just look at the positive yoga scores for those involved, the Sun, I believe that says 1.2. So that's positive. And Mercury's got 4.2. So we definitely do have some support to amplify and make this yoga happen. Okay, so we've talked about second house, a whole lot of different things there, money and a sense of responsibility and looking after people, perhaps the call to military service as well. And that's taking place in Capricorn, which is a sign that is owned by Saturn, who also owns the third house, Aquarius, and Saturn is placed in the third house. So what was interesting about the third house?
Well, we have a Rashi aspect coming from Mars. So Mars and the agendas of its houses, that in the 12th, are going to play a role into his third house development. And Mars is in a friend's dignity. So there's going to bring a sense of right and wrong to this third house, but it's also going to bring a lot of courage and motivation that they're going to apply to their skills and abilities. The third deals a lot with associates. Elvis had an entourage, which he dubbed the Memphis Mafia. And these were just made up of like friends and associates that he knew from way back. And they were like this, like they protected Presley, but they also acted as just people that he could surround himself who would attend to his needs, but also just be part of his life experience with. They were just like his entourage. And I found this really interesting incident that where early in his career, they were all at Graceland and he bought a bunch of fireworks and they engaged in a game of war where they literally shot fireworks. Which has a certain Martian quality, war and battles, a little element of danger and risk.
Like the third house is our band of brothers, isn't it? And your story about the fireworks there also, I think, has something Rahu about it too. And maybe even Rahu Saturn, that Rahu is the risk taker and wants to do crazy things. And Saturn is ultra fearful and conservative. So having Rahu and Saturn together can produce like extremes on either end of that continuum, like extremely risky or extremely traditional conservative. Firing fireworks at each other in your band of brothers seems like a lovely third house Saturn Rahu with a Mars Rashi aspect story. Thought that was a really great fit.
And Rahu being in the third is an indicator that he's becoming individualized and have to see himself in the context of his strengths and his weaknesses. So it's developing that psychological balance of being okay with one's imperfections. This is going to be like a trial and error because the third is a trial and error house. And I think that's really interesting having Saturn there. Saturn, when it's being hurt, can make someone focus a little too much on it's going to cause some insecurities, and those insecurities are going to come forward and become a focus. So having Rahu with Saturn, Rahu acts like Saturn. I think that's a very interesting placement of those two planets, especially in the third house.
So speaking about Saturn, tell us about another yoga that's here in the chart as well, because Saturn is in a relationship with the sun, right? Because it is in that house after. So it's in the third house and the sun is in the second house. Tell us a little bit about that.
This is what they call an Anapha yoga. And it is formed when a planet is residing in the 12th from the moon. So we have the moon in the fourth. So Saturn is in the house before it, which is the 12th from the moon. One born will be a king, a man of influence and authority, dressed, famous, strong, magnanimous, charming, good-natured, blessed with material comforts, and happy. And so we can easily see how a lot of that is playing out and did play out in his life. But see, the quality of that yoga is going to really be informed by the planet that is forming that yoga, which is Saturn. So the effects are going to be colored of this yoga are going to be colored through a Saturnian quality. Basically, what this yoga does is that this person is going to go through a kind of a formative period where they're going to develop through hardship, through limitations and restraints. And the goal of this yoga is to help to strengthen the person through these kind of adverse conditions so that they can really springboard into this greatness that the promise of this yoga is offering. And like I said, Presley grew up very poor, and he also was bullied a lot because of his growing up poor. He listened to blues music, which at the time didn't have a lot of the appreciation, I think, that it does now with a lot of people. It was not part of the popular culture. So his love of that kind of music was something that stigmatized him. And he was also a very shy person, and also growing up poor. There's a lot of stigmatizing social factors going into this. So he did experience a lot of bullying growing up. And so he was able to persevere through them and really develop his talent, his skills and ability in music. He didn't read music. He never received formal training. He mostly received a lot of instruction from people as he developed into being a musician, but he was mostly picked things up by his ear. And I think that's really interesting. Later in life, he did become an arranger of a lot of his music, and he had assembled a large group of musicians that were his background, and he was able to help. He basically orchestrated them. I thought this was a very interesting yoga to explore because it's very formative. And if you think about the development of these signs, how we often think that greatness isn't just something someone is born with, it's something that is also cultivated and developed. And a lot of times it's through adverse conditions that we are refined into becoming a much greater soul in the world.
It's just fascinating. I was actually feeding you the other yoga, which is the Saturn rising after the sun. But it's true that Saturn is also rising before the moon. So it's forming these two yogas at the same time. And I love what you're saying about Saturn rising before the moon and how that has made some very difficult experiences. And like you say, some things that are not valued by other people. And yet over time, they've had the strength to come good and produce great things in his life, like this ability to arrange music. But Saturn is also rising before the sun, and that's also creating a yoga.
Yeah. The best in yoga, you can use the planet and it becomes this quality that is beneath the surface. And it only comes out as people get to know you, especially because it is Saturn that we're talking about. Saturn has this drive, but it's also this Saturn is like the pack animal that just keeps going and is very driven. It just slogs along. So this yoga is all about squeezing most out of things in order to get that benefit from it. So it's something that there's a lot of pressure involved and a lot of drive underneath this that is not necessarily something that is conscious in a way. It's just this thing that one does. In this case, this is one of the drivers that kind of pushed him to his limits where he was using amphetamines. And one of the things that, if you look at his career, is once he, like in the 60s, going into the 70s, he was in a Saturn dasha. So he was working constantly and just always busy. He made lots of movies. He did a lot of albums. He was just constantly working, touring. And so one of the things to keep that momentum going is through what you would call performance enhancing substances and just pushing yourself constantly, because it gets to this point of like more and more. And with Saturn being a planet that is about not necessarily thriving, but just doing it, just getting into there and just doing it and slogging it out, but not necessarily thinking about the goal. It's just, I just got to keep this up. So I think it's a really interesting yoga to study to get maybe a little hidden slice of Presley's personality that wouldn't normally be apparent.
I think that's so true, Craig. And when we were talking about this essay, you and I was saying, I don't particularly know that much about Elvis. He seemed larger than life and excessive and over the top maybe, and obviously very famous. And none of those things particularly seem very Saturnian. But then you look at this, and I agree with you that he worked a lot, this just enormous body of work. And we were saying at the start of this podcast, what is it that keeps people going? This fame, this almost dharmic calling to fame. And you can imagine here Saturn is like just cracking the whip and just really keeping this person moving forward. So I think this yoga is very insightful. And then it helps you to realize actually the look, the dark eyes, the dark hair, the dark eyebrows. There was some Saturn in his appearance. And we can see, if you're looking on screen, the Sthana Bala, the way the stance that they take in life is also got a lot of points, 173 points. And there's so much to talk about in this paper. As usual, when we do our 10,000 word papers, we're nowhere near getting towards the end of the paper, even though we're getting towards the end of our time. So I wanted to just pop in here that you and I also looked at some health yogas for Elvis, didn't we? And we noticed that Saturn was playing a role there too, that he ended up really dying of, in some ways, old people's diseases, didn't he? That he really wore his body out, that by the time he passed, he'd worn out his body.
He was very old before his time. He actually was 42 years old when he died, which I found very shocking, because it's like the idea that someone, you think about the amount of activity that he did and the scale of it, you would think that would have taken longer to unfold, but it was just a very brief amount of time. And pretty much like from, let's see, he went into his Saturn dasha in 1958, right as he went into the military. And so for the rest of his life, he was in a Saturn dasha. The Saturn dasha ended in September of 77. He actually died, I believe, in August.
Fascinating, the role that Saturn is playing in this chart. And so insightful that Vesi yoga, rising after the sun, and also, as you were sharing, rising before the moon, being very formative as well. So I've taken us off track there. Is there anything that we'd like to say about the fourth house?
So it's like the fourth house, as we went over when I was looking at the first, is the mother.
Yes.
Is a very important aspect to his life. We have that moon there, and the moon is the ninth from the eighth, which while he had luck and good fortune, there was also discomfort and misery. The moon, even though it's waxing and it's giving him like all these increases, he's also got this aspect to the moon because of its dignity that's not going to feel a lot of the benefit, because it is in a lesser dignity. So like you can have all these wonderful things, but one's emotional environment around these things is in a miserable state.
And let's talk now about the fifth house moving to Aries, ruled by Mars. Mars being there in the 11th house. What were some of the insights around the fifth house of creativity and children?
We have Saturn, Rashi aspecting from Aquarius, and that's going to bring the qualities of Saturn into that fifth house of creativity. It's going to bring that ambition to develop and really go into one's creativity. But it also has a separating factor to it. And because the fifth house is also children, one of the things is that the demands and pressures of Presley's career separated him from his daughter, Lisa Marie, for very long stretches of time. And so while you have this fifth house of children and creativity, there really isn't really a lot of time to enjoy a lot of that, the fruits, because he's constantly working. And right when Lisa Marie was born was when he had like his resurgence in his career. And so from 68 on, he was pretty much touring fairly regularly and he was very active. And so that really left him little time for his family and particularly his daughter.
So interesting, isn't it? Being there in the 11th house. We talk about how the 11th house can be a yoga breaker. We're talking there really about the 11th Lord going and mixing itself up in some kind of Raja yoga that's in the chart. But in this case, Mars owns the fifth. So it's got this dharmic energy and it's in the 11th. So those ambitions really taking us away from the fifth house as well, from our children.
He's doing it for her, but at the same time, he's not enjoying it with her. He's not doing it because you think of Mars as like these ideals and right and wrong, and going into it with the idea of I'm going to work for my daughter. But at the same time too, you're not spending the quality time. It's that work-life balance that was never quite got resolved in his mind and in his life. It just didn't.
And what about the sixth house of Taurus?
So we have several planets impacting through their Rashi aspect. We have Mars and Sun and Mercury, and that's going to bring a lot of different houses into play into the sixth. Mars rules the fifth and 12th houses. So there is this idea of mantras, religious practices, liberation, qualities that are around Mars that are going to play out in this aspect that's going to be part of his everyday life. And he really did have a lifelong interest in developing some sort of spiritual practice. Going back to Rahu being in the third with Ketu in the ninth, you have someone who's coming from a spiritual kind of philosophy, but now they're going to have to try to figure out something that works for them. And so in this life, he was really sorting that out and trying to find the balance of that. So we have that kind of playing out to Mars's aspect into the sixth house.
That reminds me also of what you shared about him really picking up karate from his time in Asia. That's a daily practice that has a spiritual element to it, but it's a martial art. So it's bringing that Martian Rashi aspect onto my daily practice, but that has the moksha/mantra qualities. So yep, we see that coming through in his daily practices.
Another thing that was interesting was an article based off of the biography of his hairdresser. And his hairdresser was a member of Self-Realization Fellowship. I believe his hairdresser gave Presley a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And Presley became very interested in that. And in this article I found, the hairdresser said that Presley actually reached out and had several phone conversations with Sri Adayamata. Sri was the chairman and president of Self-Realization Fellowship at the time. And I don't know if she really, to what extent he got involved with the organization, but he did express a desire of how he wanted to he would have just loved to have quit music altogether and enjoy more of a monastic life. What was interesting is that according to this hairdresser, Sri Dayamata said, you can probably do more good by being the example in the life that you have now than just quitting and going away. The sixth house of like daily routines. And one of the things that self-realization fellowship also talks about is that you can be a householder. You can be a person who works every day in the world and still be a person who is a spiritual person. He also struggled with that in the sense of trying to find that balance, because we do have Venus, Lord of the sixth. And while we have all these wonderful love and appreciation of the arts and music and stuff, we also have luxuries and rich foods, which is something that he was very prone to. Really into high fatty foods and comfort foods, which of course affected his nutrition. Like we were saying with sixth house, is he did have more of a poorer diet that was more rooted in, I would say, like emotional eating probably, or something like that, or just feeling good. One of his favorite foods was a peanut butter and banana sandwich, which I think was fried in 2 sticks of butter or something like that. It's been a long time since that, which of course some unfathomable thing now in this age of like healthy living. People would think that would just be outrageous, but that was one of his favorite meals, one of his favorite foods. And so you have to think about some of the impacts of Venus playing into this, but it is something that, as I found through the chart, that was like a prevalent theme of him trying to find that balance between the demands of being an entertainer with the demands of a more personal life and a more like individualized life, or what one wants or what one would want out of it.
It's just such a rich chart. I really recommend people getting in touch with Craig and having a read of this essay, because we can't do justice to it. There's always so much to talk about, which is why I'm going to ask you now to tell us a little something about the seventh house.
Once again, because the seventh house is in Gemini, we have the only aspect is coming from the moon. So we have relationships being impacted by that moon, just like the first house, the fourth house, seventh house, and 10th house. So that means we have an eighth house influence basically to all the angle houses. So there's going to be an overarching theme of emotional security around a lot of these, about the activities in the world. There's also going to be unexpected breaks and chronic disease, because the eighth is also chronic disease, that are going to be part of, in this case, one's relationships, but also one's relationships with the public, partnerships, and one's image too, in the sense of the public. So there's going to be this idea of that emotional security in these types of things. And so it's another factor that is a motivator to a lot of his work ethic and his approach to his career, and how also played out in all of his relationships, really, and how that more inner insecurity was another influence and motivator behind a lot of things in his life. As Mercury as the Lord, Mercury is being combust with the sun, and it's suffering. And this is one of the things where a person can make bad decisions in terms of picking partners.
We've got Mercury, as you're saying, the seventh Lord, in the second house. They're both Marika houses, aren't they? And as you're pointing out, the sun is at 17 degrees, Mercury's at 22 degrees. A lot of aspect happening there. Do you think that contributed to some of the difficulties with the marriage?
It's going to impact communication, which is very important for a relationship. And then with that sun hitting it, there's just going to be a lot of difficulty with authority figures. Coming back to his relationship with Colonel Tom Parker, that's also going to play out in their relationship.
Exactly. I'm just having a look at the Art and Science of Vedic Astrology, Volume 2, to those Bhava Yogas. If we look at some of the things where we mix that number 7 and number 2 together, we can be prone to seek satisfaction outside of committed relationships, for example, support mistresses, difficulty in breaking ties with bad relationships. So these sort of all feed into those themes that you're talking about with Colonel Parker, and with maybe having extramarital affairs.
Yes. And that was something that I did find that did happen. Both Presley and Lisa Marie, there were affairs on both parts. He would be away in Hollywood and she would be at Graceland in Tennessee. Their relationship was really dominated by his public perception. And Presley met Priscilla when she was 14 and he was 24 in the military in Germany. And Parker basically felt like in that to protect his public image, they had to keep the relationship secret because there was a huge potential for damage from this type of relationship. And also to the fact that when someone like Presley was seen as a heartthrob, so ever forbid a heartthrob gets married and all his female fans stop buying his records. So it's almost like in a way you could say like the public was the other person in the relationship there. And so everything revolved around that perception. So she spent a lot of time in seclusion, and initially I think a lot of the relationship wasn't made public for many years up until I think around the time they got married. Her needs in the relationship became secondary to the needs of his career and his public persona.
If we look at Mercury, the number of Shadbala points, it's the weakest, isn't it? It doesn't even have 100% of Shadbala. And if we were to look at Venus as the other Karaka for women in the chart, it's number 6 out of 7 in terms of potency. You feel for the spouse in this chart, whoever the spouse is going to be in this chart, they're a little bit in a powerless position, and they're in the least powerful positions. Leading on from the 7th house leads us naturally to the 8th house, which we have touched on a little bit because the moon is so important in this chart. That need for connection, possibly sexual connection, is also feeding into this extramarital affairs situation that we were talking about. So tell us a little bit about the 8th house and Cancer.
So we are getting a Rashi aspect from Saturn and Rahu. So that's something you want to really pay attention to, because you have Saturn hitting that 8th house, and the 8th house is about longevity, and Saturn is a limiting factor. And you have Rahu, which can bring a lot of disruption to that 8th house. We also have an aspect coming from Jupiter. So that's going to help with a lot of the breaks and changes that he experiences in life by giving him a little bit of a cushion to see things from a more higher plane or a higher view with a bigger picture.
But it's so interesting what you're saying, the 8th house of longevity, getting those aspects from Saturn and Rahu, challenging aspects, and also makes me think about using amphetamines to stimulate vitality. That's seems like a Rahu thing to me. And Jupiter aspecting from the 12th house of escaping and addictions. Like you say, it is cushioning, but that in that way that sometimes benefics don't actually help us. They allow us to indulge and soften when perhaps we should be being honest or truthful.
And getting back to the Vesi yoga of the Saturn being driven and really pushing oneself, and it's aspecting the 8th houses, which is going to cause a break and really develop chronic illness. So you have that Saturn and Rahu really impacting that 8th house and really bringing those energies into it.
And then let's talk about the 9th house, because that brings us also the theme of marriage that we were talking on before when we were in the 7th house. The 9th house in this chart is Leo. We've got Ketu there. But of course, the house itself is owned by the sun.
Well, Ketu's placement, like I said before, is the person found a lot of security in past lifetimes through belief systems. And now this time it's about one's individual path and finding what works best for them and finding the purpose in that. And we have the aspect coming from Mars, from Libra. And so we're going to have that Martian quality coming into a 9th house. That is very much about like right and wrong. So we have a very idealistic planet hitting that 9th house of purpose. But we also have a Sun, Mercury, and Venus. We have the Lord aspecting. So there's going to be some good stuff coming from that because we have the Lord aspecting its own house. But we also have Mercury and Venus. They're going to give qualities, though, of charisma and intellect to this. And he was very open about his faith, and he was very much a part of his identity in the sense of like the sun as an indicator of one's person and one's body. As he was, like I said, he was very devout, and he did gospel songs, and he spoke openly a lot about matters of faith and his beliefs, and really tried to embody that and aspire to that as a son, as a king, trying to be the example.
The 9th house of good fortune, we've already talked about in our Vishnu Yoga, that this is part of what's contributed to this extraordinary success, isn't it? The sun, the 9th lord of good fortune, is aspecting its own house, the 9th house, from the 2nd house of income. So that's got to be good. And it's got that Yuva Avashta in that it's got active karma to give. But it's Sushupti, which always worries me when you've got Yuva, Avastha and Sushupti together. That's like karma that you're not going to be awake to. It's just going to come up and get you. And I guess in this sense that those, whatever calling there was to the ninth to maybe have a more spiritual life or to live according to those traditions, like the ninth, it's those devoted traditions, are going to be impacted by this enormous financial success and sense of responsibility and all the people in his entourage that he wants to be able to support, and not just support, but lavish gifts upon these two kind of things competing with each other. And K2 being that separative force that you've already spoken about was really not allowing us to get any more fulfillment from that traditional path of following religion or the faith or whatever it is, following our culture. No matter what he did to try to get back towards that life of the simple life of faith and devotion, his chart just wasn't set up to support that.
And then we also have the starvation coming from Venus, which means one's going to listen to the counsel of others more than the counsel of oneself. And that's going to lead to being sidetracked.
We've got the mutual Sun-Saturn situation there, haven't we? They're both doing the worst for each other. We're sacrificing what we think we should in order to be great. And we're doing what we think we should in order to be great, but it's not what we would have chosen for ourselves. They're mutually starving each other. Yeah, it's
not good. It's not a good way, not a good platform for making the best decisions for oneself.
Nope. And then, of course, let's talk about the 10th house, because this is somebody who is very well known and is very well known for their work outside of the house. So we're expecting that the 10th house is important.
As before, you have the moon, the only planet aspecting, which is going to bring that quality of self-expression and emotional environment into the 10th house. The Lord is suffering from combustion. There's going to be some difficulty really in standing because of the Mercury Shambhala score. Is not going to be able to stand very strongly during periods where Mercury's being activated, which is if you're already prone to yielding to the counsel of others, it's going to be difficult for you to really stand in your own self. But Mercury is the Lord of the 10th in the second. There's going to be some positive bhava yogas through the use of one's voice. So one of the things that we did find is his generosity, and through the power of his singing career, he was able to help people through his activities in the world. But then it's also going to have some negative qualities where he's going to receive mistreatment. And once again, the theme of not being able to establish the right boundaries. And we talked about how, like with Colonel Tom Parker, he was just kind of like, as long as I'm getting what I'm getting, it's okay. But didn't quite know how to find a way to stand in those boundaries. He just let certain things play out instead of actually communicating and effectively confronting with a lot of aspects of his life that really could, if he might have had a little bit more control over his life and how it was going to go. I think that's getting back to a lot of things with his desire to do spiritual practices and live his life in a different way. You could go back to the idea that he did have this problem with really establishing those boundaries. So it left him open to just listening to what other people told him and being a little bit more conscious towards that, of wanting to do right by others. But there also has to be a certain element of it where you're doing something for yourself as well. And I think there's that boundary was something that I found, like through his whole chart, that there's a trouble there that kind of is getting in the way. Then you look at someone like Presley and he had all this fame and all the success, but it gets to a point where it's so large, it's so much larger than yourself. And, the idea of establishing boundaries within that, especially if you didn't necessarily do that in the beginning, it gets harder as time goes on.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a really interesting combination on so many different continuums, but that one that you're speaking about, boundaries, and whether this is something that I personally really want, is just reinforced over and over again. We were just talking about the Sun Venus starvation. That's a good way to be confused about what you really want. And then we've got Mercury not being able to set boundaries. We've got Jupiter, the first lord in the 12th house, already gives us problems with boundaries. We've got Jupiter with a very low Ayana score, so it's not going to confront those things. And Venus is our next lord, owning the 11th house of ambitions and desires. And I remember when I was reading your essays thinking, what about all of these luxury cars? What's going on with Venus? That's what I wanted to know. So tell us about Venus and the 11th house and any other insights about the 11th house.
Mars is placed in there in the 11th and is being aspected by Saturn and Rahu. And if you think about Mars has a restless quality to him. We have this house of our greatest desires, the desires fulfilled. And with the Lord of the 5th and the 12th, it's bringing this quality of creativity and self-expression and a sense of destiny arriving at the place of the house of one's dreams and greatest desires realized. We have the ruler of the 11th in the second house, Venus. He's going to be very supportive of his community and his fans. He's also going to get some gains and titles, and where he gets the moniker, the king of rock and roll. Venus naturally rules vehicles. And we are going to see, as a result of those gains, him expressing himself through vehicles and through cars and through gifting. You're going to see that coming forward. And also just giving yourself with luxuries as like the validation of that we want as in terms of the 11th house. And I think he had 30 cars and it was just ridiculous. And I know I found this one story where not only did he buy cars for himself, but he bought cars for other people. I think it's one of those stories that's very like, there's different iterations of that, but he was driving. Presley didn't like to fly. He was afraid of flying, but so he was driving somewhere to a concert or something. And there was a person with a broke down vehicle and he stopped. He tried to help the person. And I'm trying to visualize him in all of his like Las Vegas splendor, trying to help push this farmer's truck going again. And it wouldn't work. And so he gave the guy a ride to town and ended up buying him a car and then drove back with him and helped him load it into the new vehicle. So that way the guy could deliver his stuff to market. Venus is in the second house of one's resources and one's responsibilities and one's values. It's that one would want to express one's values through buying people cars.
Yeah, totally. As you were speaking about it, even having Mars there in that 11th house brings to mind Graceland, right? Because Mars is sort of bricks and mortar. And what is this recognition and validation? And yeah, it was very physical. And so that brings us to the 12th house, something that we flagged right at the beginning because we know we've got the Ascendant Lord there and that it is important. The 12th house is taking place in Scorpio. What were some of the insights you found by looking at his 12th house?
We did have this idea that we talked about because the first Lord is in the 12th, the idea that is a focus of a person's life. And Mars being the Lord of the 12th. Mars is, I believe, one of his strongest planets.
The strongest.
So that means that those houses are going to be manifested well in his life, and especially the yogas around that. And so being able to turn losses into gains. And that's one of the things that's interesting in there, because that's just a little thing, but it's the idea that Presley spent lavishly, but he never had a lack in money to spend.
Yes.
And so that means he always had money with him. And we have to think too, that back in that day, there weren't credit cards like there are now and stuff like that. So he always either paid in a check or paid in cash, but he always had that ready cash nearby. But it's also going to bring, because Mars is strong, is that the gains from through spiritual activity. And in particular, you could see that because of his life getting back to what he was told with Sri Dayamata, that he could do more good in this world through his career as a singer. And so in a sense, it's a karma yoga, a yoga of action. So he was a very generous person. And so he would use those expenses, not only for himself, but also to help others. So you can see it in terms of Mars being that planet ideals and convictions of wanting to give back. I feel blessed, so I'm going to bless others. And why didn't you have Jupiter there, which kind of has that much grander, seeing things on a much higher plane going into it. So it lends itself to selfless action with the goal of being liberated from it. And he didn't really have any difficulty with his Mars because it was so strong. And he was getting Mars is getting a lot of support. It's getting hurt a little bit by Mercury. It's one enemy, but it's not going to get too much in the way. So it's going to make him overthink from time to time, which we found that he did struggle a lot with his spirituality and like the path of his spirituality. But very much because we have Mars involved. Mars is a planet of action and diving into things. So like that story about helping a person who was stranded along the road, that's very Martian, the quality of jumping into action, but also using your wealth and your expenses to help another person. So you can see how that plays out in the sense of not only helping the person along the side of the road, but buying them a car.
Yes. And as I'm looking at it, Craig, people can't see this if you're not watching the YouTube. So for those people listening along, the Cheshtabala of all of the planets is really quite low apart from Mars. So the sun has 5% of the Cheshtabala it needs. Moon has got 50%. Mercury's got 30%. Jupiter, 42%. Venus, 27%. And Saturn, 36%. So across the board, really struggling there. And the Mars is the only one that comes close to its required amount. It's got 93%. You can see that this is a person that to us on the outside looks like he has everything he could ever want in his life and very famous and very talented. We would imagine that he was confident, and yet we know you've already shared that he had stage fright and was afraid of flying. And we know from listening to this chart now that perhaps had problems with boundaries, but also just didn't have confidence in all of those other planets. But in Mars, he did have that confidence. So all of that military service, the martial arts, and like you said, the Bhava yogas around turning losses into gains. He just, he had the confidence in that.
And getting back to like the fifth house, which Mars rules, is like the idea of creativity, that he had really good instincts about music and he had really good instincts as far as the creative aspects of his career. And one of the things I talked about was that kind of really catapulted him back into the public spotlight was the 1968 comeback special. And that was very much where he was in control, and he wasn't really in terms of the music and the presentation of that, because he wanted to portray himself in this way. And it's interesting being someone who, like I said, was a self-taught musician. He had, like you also think about like song choice and presentation. He did have he was very confident in a lot of his musical and creative choices. I think that was very much reflective, and particularly during that time when he did the comeback special, because originally it was supposed to be a Christmas special. And if you go back and watch it, it's a very iconic image of Elvis in leather, head to toe in leather, and he's just playing his music his way. And so it was very much him reintroducing himself to the musical landscape. And again, it also shows it in the movie also as well, where he just brushed aside what everybody else wanted for him to do in that moment. But from a creative standpoint, it's like, nope, I'm going to do this. So I think that's really interesting too, with that influence of Mars, particularly too, coming back to the ninth house, very strong in conviction, very strong in that sense of purpose and making those decisions, very confident in giving and generosity, and also too supporting people around him, because with Mars aspecting the third house of associates.
Yes. Gosh, there's so many really fascinating things in this chart. It's just been wonderful to have you have the time to share this with us, Craig. Thanks so much. Thanks to all the listeners who are still with us. There's a couple of things that I just want to point out, that we're recording this at a time when tragically Elvis's daughter has also passed away too soon. So not only the father has had a very short life, but the daughter has had a very short life. And it's happened just as Craig and I were discussing this assessment. So we wanted to put our thoughts into the podcast, but also it makes me think about the D12, the Varga chart that helps us perhaps see something that we're gaining from our maternal lineage, something that we're gaining from our paternal lineage, and how that is giving us a little mission in our life. And it makes me wonder about Elvis's D12 and Lisa Marie's D12 and her son's D12. So that is going to be our Astrolojam topic for this month coming up, which will be in February. If you have enjoyed this podcast, if you really like getting into these charts and reading all of the beautiful intricacies of a chart, why not come along to Astrolojam, and we'll give you the dates for this birth chart and for Lisa Marie's birth chart as well, and that invitation to especially look at the D12 and see what we can see as being some heritage that is passing through these charts. I wonder if there's anything there. I hope that you will come along and join me for that. Craig, I want to thank you so much for your generosity in sharing this chart with us. We appreciated your research and thanks for sharing it so generously with us here on the Vedic Astrology podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me. Yes, thank you. It was wonderful.
Great. We know you've got one more paper to come in this practicum year, so who knows, we might have you back on the show. I'm already looking forward to reading your third paper.
Awesome.
Thanks everyone who's been listening to all the way up to this point. So hoping to see you at Astrolojam and be able to interact with you. I'll put the link of how to do that and also the link of how to contact Craig if you would like to get a hold of the paper or discuss any of the more of the details of the Elvis Presley paper. Thanks everyone. See you next time on the Vedic Astrology podcast. Bye for now. Bye.